Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist, with me, Josh Hamilton. Scott Santens, the writer, full-time advocate of Universal Basic Income, and the editor of Basic Income Today, was my guest on this episode of Chatter. I first heard about the idea of Universal Basic Income during my time at university, and I've been fascinated by the idea ever since. I've thought for quite a while that at some point in the future we may need to adopt some form of basic income to help offset the loss of jobs from automation, and right now because of COVID. And this was a fantastic excuse to get Scott on my show and to quiz him on everything UBI. We get into how to pay for it, why we should be pushing for it now, the creation of a gift economy, and how UBI could drive us away from cheap throwaway consumerism. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. So, here's Scott. Hi Scott, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on. I'm glad to have someone who I frequently in my head describe as the UBI guy here to talk about UBI.
Yeah. No, I talk about UBI a lot.
So why don't you start off maybe by describing what UBI is to you and how you would define it personally?
Yeah, I would describe it as society investing in itself. You know, this is with an amount of money that goes to all of its members without work requirement and as individuals on a regular basis for life. So this is just a permanent monthly income floor underneath everyone.
Okay, well, that's quite a nice way of putting it. So it's anytime I've seen it discussed, it's very much been in the vein of, okay, well, like this is something for the far future. This is something for, you know, when there's not much work around, when everything has been automated. So why should we be discussing this now? Like, why is it important to be thinking about, you know, in 2020?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I would usually have like a different answer to that question, or somewhat different. But right now, it just seems like obviously that we need this right now, because here we are in this environment where it just makes all the sense in the world as far as a pandemic goes and mass unemployment. So we have always been talking about, you know, thinking ahead towards automation causing mass unemployment. But here we are. It's like you don't need automation to cause mass unemployment. It can be a pandemic. It can be a disaster of whatever kind, and that's just it. There's always some disaster that's around the corner, and it just makes sense to make sure that everyone actually has this firm foundation underneath them for these disasters. Because right now it just doesn't make any sense that there's, you know, plenty of food out there in stores, and yet there's lines for food banks. That there's plenty of housing, you know, but people are actually being evicted from those houses because they can't afford to stay there. You know, businesses are closing and shutting doors, not because they're doing anything wrong, but because they don't have any customers, because people don't have money to spend as customers. So we are in this position where it's extremely clear that it makes a lot of sense to make sure everyone actually has money to spend.
So when you say money to spend, like where would you where would you suggest is the right level? Because, you know, I've seen there's been talk of everything from just like a very small sort of monthly payment to like help top up your income, all the way to like proposals for UBI paying for everything that you could, you know, possibly need. Like where would you draw the line? Like what is for you the optimum sort of amount?
Yeah, so I think of this as a floor, and I would prefer to design it so that this floor rises over time in line with productivity growth. Because, you know, as we automate more, as we become more productive, it just makes sense that that should actually make all of society better off. And so I don't really care as much about what the floor starts at, just that we set the precedent that there should be a floor underneath all of us, and then make sure that it rises over time. So, you know, people usually talk about basic income in terms of poverty level. So you can set that at somewhere near the poverty level, a little bit over the poverty level, something around that amount. But wherever we set it at, I do suggest that it continues to grow over time in line with productivity. And it's also important to recognize that whatever the point is at, so let's say here in the US, if we set it at something that people consider to be low, which would be $500 per month, that would actually be at least $500 per month as that minimum amount. So anything you would earn over that would be in addition to that. So $500, that covers food for most people. That can cover a good portion of rent for most people. So it's that less amount of stuff to worry about as far as financial insecurity goes. That really, and it's not only about making sure that people have some amount of money, but it's that this is a secure, stable amount of money, that you always know that amount is going to be coming the next month. And when you know that amount is coming, then that actually increases your security, reduces stress, it enables you to plan better about how to use that money. And so there's a lot more value to a basic income beyond just the money itself.
So when you say that it has to be linked to productivity level, why do you say productivity? Or sorry, yeah. So you said it should be increasing based on productivity increases. Like, why not inflation?
Yeah, because inflation is usually below productivity increases. So I would prefer that it actually surpass inflation. I want the real value of it to grow over time as the real value of society's full prosperity grows over time. And so in the US, this is very clear, but this is also true around the world as well, that productivity has decoupled from wages. And so in the US, it happened around in the 1970s.
Was it that early?
We're actually, yeah. So we're twice as productive as we were back then. And yet, are we all like twice as well off? Like, no, because wages stayed stagnant this entire time. And that gap has grown bigger and bigger and bigger. In fact, we just did in the US a recent analysis that came out just a couple weeks ago that showed that if wages had actually been in line with productivity growth, then someone earning 30K back in the 70s, would be earning 60K now. That someone would be earning 50K then would be earning 100K now. And actually that has been $50 trillion worth has gone to the top that should have gone to everyone as a whole. And that's like at an annual basis, that's $2.5 trillion right now that should be going to the bottom 90%, that instead only gone to the top. So when people ask like how we pay for basic income, I like to point out that gap and show that, well, the money is there. It's just all going to the top right now. We are not all, as society's members, getting this dividend that we should be getting. It's only going to the top.
Now, one of the things that people kind of, especially, I don't know, say perhaps older, more conservative folks, very much like the pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of attitude that people would say, okay, so you're just giving people free money, like that's just communism or socialism, or that's just sort of left-wing madness. Like, what is your sort of general response to? Do you think that that UBI is compatible with capitalism, or does that like have to come like wholesale with like a full Marxist revolution?
Yeah, when people usually, which it's a very frequent response, but when people respond that way, I usually respond in asking, was Milton Friedman a communist? Was Friedrich Hayek a communist? Is the state of Alaska a communist state? Is the board game Monopoly a game that teaches people about communism? Like, none of that is true. And it's exactly the opposite. Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek were well-known Nobel Prize winning free market economists that anyone who talks about that should know who their names are and what they represent. And Alaska has had an annual dividend that goes to every Alaskan since 1982 of around $1,000 to $2,000. And I think it's really important that people know and recognize that. And if people ask, where has it been tried in the world? That is the best example of a UBI. because it has been operating the longest and it's been going to every single person in Alaska, child and adult, rich, poor, goes to everybody. I would also say that for someone who's asking about, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you have no boots. And so telling that to a bootless man is just messed up because it's impossible. And then, of course, there's a joke that it's not possible anyways because you can't actually do anything if you're just pulling yourself by your bootstraps. But as the saying goes, if you do believe in that saying, it's important to make sure that everyone has boots. And I would say that basic income is money for everyone to buy boots to actually make that possible.
So basically you're suggesting that everyone should have this sort of little bit of starter capital, almost like a base from which they can then choose to do whatever they want with their time, be that, perhaps inventing some new product or looking after their kids or, whatever they want. But sorry, go ahead and I'll ask my next question.
I was just going to say, just markets are extremely effective at what they do, and markets require money to make those transactions possible. That's how this all works. It's how you calculate, supply and demand. You have someone with a product or service, you have someone who wants that product or service, you're able to exchange money to make it happen. And so another way of looking at this too is basic income actually makes those transactions more possible, and therefore actually improves the functioning of markets by improving the pricing mechanism for supply demand. So as an example of this, let's say you start up a store, you're selling ice cream, and let's say you end up having to close because you just don't have enough customers. So here's your question. Did you not have enough customers because people didn't have enough disposable income to go into your store? Or did people have plenty of disposable income, but they just didn't like your ice cream? So there's no way of determining which one of those is true. The market can't do that. But you can make sure that that it's true if everyone has money, because at least that they have the money to choose whether to, say, vote for your product. And that's how it can actually improve the way markets work.
Some people would perhaps say that if you're sort of suggesting that markets and free markets will eventually mean that capital accumulates in the hands of a smaller and smaller and smaller group of people, as you've kind of suggested has happened over the past 30, 40 years, is like trying to just like give those extra few pennies to the poorest people. Is that like putting a band-aid on like a gaping wound in the whole system, or is that like the place from which you can begin to find a way to restrain the worst excesses of capitalism?
Yeah, I would actually say it's both. So on the one hand, money is beyond just money. Again, when I talk about basic income being about security too, it's also about power. And so when you have an unconditional amount of money, so you're always going to start with that. It's a right of citizenship. Then that's the ability to say no to people. And that's the ability to say no to employers offering low wages. And so actually in the US, there's a really interesting graph you can find that shows union membership versus inequality, and you see that as union membership grew, inequality went down, and as it shrank, inequality went up. And so I look at a graph like that, and I don't just see unions; I see bargaining power. That's what bargaining power creates. And so when everyone has that bargaining power through basic income, then that's when you can say to employers, "Look, I'm not going to work for you for $8 an hour. I'll do this job for $15 an hour. I'll do it for $20 an hour. I'll do it for 20 hours a week instead of 40. I'll do it in these, better working conditions instead of these terrible ones." Like, you have to be able to withhold your labor in order to make sure that labor actually pays the price that is sufficient. And that's actually, again, that's a free labor market. There is no free labor market if people are actually coerced into those labor transactions. So yeah, power is very important to UBI. And also, again, when I say both, if you actually have that unconditional amount of money, it's not just power, but that's actually the ability to do things and invest in activities that are required in order to, like, say, make the government function better, in order to actually make sure that there are the regulations that exist, that there are the taxation levels that exist. If you have that basic income, then that means you can volunteer for political campaigns, that you can even, you're more able to run for office yourself, that you're able to, volunteer for phone banks, that you're able to knock on doors. You're even able to donate to campaigns that you feel actually represent the people instead of corporations. It really is, it's power to the people in a way that's financial and economic security, but it's also power to the people as far as, citizenship goes. You see this a lot too when people actually reach retirement age and they start receiving some kind of senior pension. Then, it's not like they stop doing
Hmm.
everything. They don't. What they do is they start doing things that are a lot of unpaid activities, or starting something up. But one of the things they do become is much more active in politics.
Mm. So you think that's directly as a function of having more time?
Yeah, it's more time and that passive income that enables unpaid work. And that's, again, a key component of this, is recognizing that so much work that is valuable in society is entirely unpaid. And it's effectively done by people who can afford to do that work. So usually, let's say it's because you're a spouse of someone who makes plenty of money, so you don't have to, so you're able to do unpaid work. Or that, there's a lottery winner or a trust fund, or maybe you have some kind of passive income that happened through maybe an early retirement or something. Um, there's a lot of ways that enable people to pursue unpaid work, but always the key component is that obviously your basic needs are being met that enable you to do this other stuff.
So you mentioned Friedman and Hayek as examples as to why people should support UBI. I was not aware that either of those two free marketeers were in favor of the idea. Just because,
Mhm.
like a lot of the literature I've read based on and from those two has been very much that any kind of government intervention in the market is a hindrance to the market, and that UBI feels like a pretty large intervention, and therefore I feel like they might have thought it was a pretty large hindrance to the market in their sort of Chicago school field of economics. Like, what is the where did they support it, and you're like, what was their rationale?
Yeah, so Milton Friedman's rationale was that this operates outside the market. You're not telling the market what to do. You're just making sure that people have an amount of money, regardless of outside forces. And so he saw it also as being, well, why are we doing all these government programs that tell people what to do, that dictate certain things that are conditions of some kind, like, say, work requirements, job requirements, that you need to, say, spend on only food and only certain types of food, based on like a voucher system. Or that when it comes to housing, that you are told to go live in this housing complex in this area of the city, instead of actually having money to spend as a renter anywhere you want to. You know, the market, again, requires money, and his logic was, let's just make sure that people have money to choose for themselves. Hayek's logic too was that there is, the state isn't the only entity that dominates people. That the corporations and businesses can dominate people as well. Again, through this inability to refuse their conditions. So if you actually make sure that outside of the marketplace and as citizens, people have this amount of money, then you're not guaranteeing some um, outcome, but you're guaranteeing this level of opportunity that enables people to actually refuse domination of others, be it corporatist or state.
So they essentially saw it as something to encourage freedom and freedom of choice in the markets in terms of, so rather
Right.
than giving people the food stamps or housing, that you would basically give them the money and let them choose themselves. I guess that's a pretty, I see how that fits much better into their thinking than I'd considered. But you sort of mentioned Alaska as well as an example of you just like a fantastic case study for this. Like what could you say we've learned from that study? And do you want to maybe explain exactly what the Alaskan system is for people who don't know?
Yeah, so in the late 70s, Alaska discovered that they had a vast amount of oil wealth. And so they debated, what should we do about this? Now, traditionally, and you see this all over the world as far as natural resources goes, that people find natural resources and then they just, dig it up and sell it. And then someday it's gone. And then what do you have? Nothing. It's all done. So they thought, okay, well, let's basically convert some of this non-renewable natural resource into a permanent ongoing resource. So what they did is they created what is called the Alaska Permanent Fund. And they started putting 25% of the revenue from this into this fund that was then invested, as a giant fund in the markets. So in 1982, that was the first dividend payout. And they set up this dividend that way. So every citizen, every resident of Alaska, as in they've been there for a full year the previous year, receives this check, or they get it as their rightful ownership of this Alaska's oil wealth. And what happens as a result? Well, it of course means that poverty has been reduced, that some of the effects that have been analyzed more recently even is you've seen that over the decades it's meant that part-time employment has increased by 17%, and the effect of full-time employment has been neutral. So they found that that this extra money can lead to people doing less full-time work, but at the same time it actually increases the demand and spending, which creates new jobs and enables more people to work. So that kind of nullifies itself out for full-time work. But there is a pretty big, I think, increase as far as part-time work goes. And again, people think, well, we shouldn't expect that many, say, work effects for like say a $1,500 dividend. But if you have a family of four, then that's $6,000 for the year, and so it's a good chunk of change. And when it's up to over $2,000, family of five is $10,000, at least. And so that can really change your what you decide to do for hours of work. And so part-time work has increased. You've also seen there's been effects every time the payout goes out. Property crime goes down for a few months, and you've also seen that child obesity has decreased, and so there's actually these positive effects throughout life that they've calculated that it saved millions of dollars from less obesity in Alaska. And also another big one is that child birth weights have increased to a healthier level, and so and that's due to better maternal nutrition, and that too is a long-term kind of thing, because we know that kids who are born underweight tend to have more health issues as adults. So there's like a lot of these also long-term indicators that show that this isn't just something that improves things in the short term, but it does have better solid long-term consequences too, especially for health.
Okay. The part-time work thing is really interesting, because one of the things that I kind of often was in my mind, or in discussions that I've had with people about UBI, was that I felt that eventually at some point, and this is the way that we're going with the sort of the 4-day week, that eventually we would get to the point where everyone's still, like most people, I think will, I don't know, I don't see a point at which people don't want like a workplace to go to, at least sometimes. Do you know what I mean? That they won't get to where people won't get to a point where they go, you know, I either want to work full time or I don't. I feel like the ultimate result, perhaps 50 years down the line, maybe sooner, maybe longer. We don't know how good automation is going to be in 10 years and how freely it's going to be allowed to be used in jobs. You know, you might see sort of protectionist legislation go in. But I always kind of felt like we were drifting towards this way where most people would probably work part-time. And it would be topped up by some kind of UBI or I don't know, negative tax rates or I don't know. So that's really interesting that it actually is okay. You sort of mentioned the full-time employment hasn't gone down, but that's because of increased demand and whatnot, a little more money flowing around the economy. But did you predict that this sort of, or you know, perhaps it's just an outlier, but do you predict anything along those kind of lines in terms of the sort of move towards part-time work?
Oh, sure. And yeah, there's a really interesting discussion to have too, as far as basic income, you know, really combining well with a redefinition of what full-time is, you know, because as we go into this future and as even right now when we're dealing with unemployment, like, does it make sense that we have a group of people who are fully employed, who are working 40 hours or more, and in fact, their work levels have increased because of this crisis that we're in, their reduced bargaining power, you know, employers asking them to do more without paying them more, you know, so they can actually be loaded up with hours of work that are far beyond what they would prefer to do. And then there are people who have 0 hours and they can't find any employment at all. That situation doesn't make sense to me. It's never made sense to me. And it certainly doesn't make sense going into the future with more and more automation. So yeah, it does make sense to actually say, all right, let's make sure that the available work that we have that we can employ people with and pay them to do is divvied up better. So that instead of having people working 0 hours and a lot of hours, that everyone who wants a job can actually work, say, 20 hours. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to do as a purposeful goal, that we should purposely redefine full-time to going from 40 hours to something, say, like a 4-day week instead of 5 days, or a 6-hour day instead of 8 hours a day. Like, it's up to us as a society to like rewrite those norms, because those norms used to be very different. You know, we used to have a 6-day week. We used to work, you know, 60 hours normal. So we should redefine that. As far as people choosing part-time or full-time, I think that is something that there's a couple of things to be said about that. First is that I think it is easier to do this, you know, part-time work. It's if you can already have a job of some kind, maybe you're already doing unpaid work, but you're like, hey, I can actually fit part-time, you know, a 15, 20-hour job or something into my schedule. And I would happily do that for this extra income. And so there's that. On the other side of it too, especially for people who are receiving some kind of benefits already, part-time work is the most difficult to actually accept, because if you accept a part-time job, then you'll get a little bit more money, and it is most likely going to erase the benefits that you are getting, to the point where you actually be worse off accepting the part-time job than you are the benefits. And such that the only thing that makes sense is to accept like a good paying full-time job. And so those can be very difficult to come by, which then means that you have all these people who prefer to stay on benefits because that's the right, you know, it just makes sense to do that. So then when you have this fully unconditional floor, suddenly it makes a lot more sense to be able to choose that part-time work, because you're always better off choosing it with a UBI than you are with any kind of conditional benefit.
So what do you make of the... Actually, hang on, let's go. I'll save that for later. So what sort of time scale do you see this, that sort of transition happening on, and to the point where, you know, UBI is like a widely accepted thing? So maybe you don't like see it being inevitable, but I kind of get that. I feel like that's the way we're talking, that this is almost an inevitability, that something of this form
yeah.
will just like there's almost too much momentum behind the idea at this point. So like, what sort of time scale do you see this unfolding over? Maybe in the US, like globally, it's a bit more difficult to say, but for your home country.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's also interesting to point out that the U.S. almost led the way on this. And so, Nixon proposed a variant of basic income.
Really? Nixon?
Nixon. So he was going to guarantee income for families. So it would have excluded childless adults, but it actually would have guaranteed income for all families in the U.S. and based entirely on just what people were earning. It didn't care if people were unemployed. For the most part, there was like a small work requirement that actually could mean that the primary earning males of households, if they refused to work, they would have lost their income. But then the mother and the kids, would have kept theirs. So there's some details in there that are interesting to get into, but overall, he was actually leading the way on a guaranteed income in the U.S., and that was also why we did a bunch of pilots in the U.S. even back in the 70s. So we did guaranteed income experiments in New Jersey was the first one. We did Gary, Indiana. We did rural North Carolina. And we did, the biggest ones were in Seattle and Denver. And so these experiments were, different lengths of time, usually a few years, up to about 6 years. And the amounts varied because they wanted to see, like, what is the effect on work for a higher versus a lower amount? And also, what is the effect on work based on a larger versus a smaller clawback rate? For the amount of income based on what you were earning. And very interesting experiments and data from that as well. But politically speaking, it of course was interesting how Nixon was behind this, and we passed it in our House of Representatives twice, in 1970 and 1971. It actually was such a big deal that it was labeled as HR 1 in 1971. HR 1 being the first bill proposed in a brand new Congress. So that first bill is usually, kind of has a like ceremonial value. They're saying this is the most important thing for us to pass. Let's do it immediately. And so for that was guaranteed income in 1971. It did not make it through the Senate in either year. It was stopped there. But if it had made it through the House, Nixon, of course, would have signed it into law because he was the one that proposed it.
Can I pause you 1 second before you keep going?
Yeah.
Was that who do you know who had control of the House and the Senate at that point?
Yeah, so it was Democrats.
Okay. In the Senate as well. They had the House and the Senate? Okay.
Yeah, and so it couldn't make it through the Senate Finance Committee. The Senate Finance Committee was actually chaired by a Democrat. He was a Southern Democrat named Russell Long. Interestingly, too, Russell Long was the son of Huey Long, and Huey Long is actually someone who pushed for his own very high UBI back in the day before he was assassinated. He called it the Share the Wealth program. And so Russell Long, his reasoning against guaranteeing income was, quote, "who will press my shirts?" He was worried that Southern workers would gain too much power from having a guaranteed income and could actually refuse to do stuff that he wanted them to do at the price he wanted. So he was against that. And of course, there's also some racism in this too, as a Southern Democrat, that it was also, it was more about Black Americans and having that power versus white Americans. But in general, it's about that power. And also a couple other elements that prevented its passage at the Senate was that Democrats actually wanted a higher amount. So there were some who weren't on board with the rest because they thought it was too low. And on the conservative side, from among Republicans, they were concerned about women gaining too much freedom and divorcing their husbands.
That's amazing.
So all those kind of
Wow.
together, mixed into it not making its way through the Senate.
I mean, that rings a little sort of bitter, doesn't it? The Democrats having too high a bar, being too pure about what they were passing to get it through.
Yeah.
That kind.
Yeah, and we're still seeing that. Like, it's not like it's just over and over again. So yeah, right now, as far as like the timeline that we're in right now, I believe that obviously this is something that we should have done decades ago, that we could have led the world on decades ago. But here we are now. They're still not the first country to actually adopt a full basic income, and we can be that country. It depends on a lot of factors, but I think that the game really changed as far as when this coronavirus hit here in worldwide. It really changed the equation. A lot of countries are learning that what matters is making sure people actually receive income, and that they shouldn't be, making work a requirement in order to receive that income, and it actually stimulates economies and prevents a lot further unemployment. So here in the U.S., I don't see it under a Trump presidency.
You don't think that they could sell
again,
it to him? Like, say he wins in November, but the Democrats take the House and the Senate. Like, okay, right, this is a really like fantastical scenario. But I've really been considering like what happens if that does happen, because I think it's not like beyond the realms of possibility that the Democrats take the Senate but not the presidency and like hold on to the House. So you don't think they could like be like, we'll just call it the Trump basic income, and he'd be like, it says Trump on it, and then sign.
Yeah, when Trump first entered office, I was willing, to give him the benefit of the doubt as far as a unknown kind of, wild card, and I thought, well, yeah, just call it Trump bucks, and Trump can be into it. But the interesting thing too is that during his presidency, he's actually made a point of increasing the conditions on existing benefits. So he wanted to introduce work requirements for healthcare through Medicaid, that he wanted to make it harder to receive food stamps. And, there's been this restricting of this in increasing the requirements. And that doesn't point to someone who's interested in basic income. And at the same time too, he's never been asked about it, which is weird.
Yeah,
like,
I think
I'm surprised that he's not on record. No one has asked him about what are your thoughts, on a universal basic income. The closest is the stimulus check, and he has, approved of the stimulus check. He was very proud to sign his name on the stimulus check. He was willing to like hold that up the process in order to make sure he could sign his name on it. And wanted people to know that he sent that to them. So that's good that he was into that. And it's good even recently that he has said, hey, we've got $300 billion that we haven't spent yet, that we've already allocated for assistance. Let's just make sure everyone gets that in the form of another stimulus check. I just need Congress to give me the okay in order to do that. Like, that's good too. It's a positive sign. But my concern is his willingness to do, an actual ongoing stimulus, instead of thinking that, that hurts the work ethic, and it actually, prevents people from employment and all this like nonsense. That's what I'm concerned about. And also, Biden, he has felt like the same way. It's like he's talked about basic income in terms of like, people need the dignity of work, and blah blah.
Like, what do you make of arguments like that, where people be like, what would people do all day? You give them some money, they don't have to work, they won't. Like, do you think people would find a way? Do you think it's very much an individual thing that each person has to figure out how much?
Well, it's funny too when it comes to both of them. So Biden is receiving about 21 basic incomes a month, and so that's through his Senate pension. He receives about $250,000 every month, and that's his floor. So it's not, he doesn't have to do anything for it. He gets that until the day he dies, and that's what his starting point is every month, is at around $250,000. So
That's such a
Does that
joke.
rob him of the dignity of work? Like, of course not. He still works, doing all kinds of things. He's running for
Yeah, he's
president.
running for the hardest job in the like potentially like probably the hardest
Right.
job in the world.
Yeah. I mean, he's what, almost 80 years old, and he's still working hard, and his giant pension is not preventing him in any way. In fact, I would say, it's enabling him to do this. And Trump too, like he was already receiving a basic income at the age of 3, I believe. Like, he already had a giant trust fund. He was already a millionaire, and he was a child because of the money that his father provided. And so neither of them have ever, felt that they were robbed of dignity because of this passive income that they both have. So yeah, when you actually have a passive income that is not, requiring you to do anything to receive it, you don't do nothing. You're enabled to do whatever it is that's important to you. You're able to earn income on top of it. You're able to pursue unpaid work. You can do volunteering. Like, there's all kinds of work that you're enabled to do by having that in being free of poverty and the fear of poverty.
So, like, what would you make of? So there's a few critiques that I've read of UBI where they were saying that the problem with our current economic system is not that people do not have enough money to spend. It's that we have so much focus on consumerism, and that UBI is basically a way of continuing to prop up the sort of unsustainable levels of consumerism that we have become accustomed to in the West, rather than saying, okay, maybe we need to look at this and say, what is enough? Like, should we be saying, okay, people, focus more on, growing your own vegetables? Or, do you need those 3 like flights abroad every year? Or, just that kind of like, do we need to consider that perhaps less is sufficient for humans? Or, and is UBI like propping up the consumerist culture that, is often like so heavily critiqued?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things here where I would argue that a lot of the consumerism and the level that we're seeing it is due to a lack of basic income. Because again, it's not just about the money. It's that if you don't start with money, if it's not guaranteed, if you don't have that floor, then you're always chasing money. And so people are spending their entire lives chasing money, and then they compare against each other. So you have this just giant like chase for anything you can get. You're advertising that you're better than everyone else, and we have an economy that's built on perpetual growth because it needs to have that growth in order to perpetuate itself. I argue that basic income enables us to close that loop. That you're actually, instead of requiring constant growth, you're just making sure that the money circulates, instead of continually going up and staying there and then requiring new amounts of growth, to get to the bottom, and then for that to go up too. You got to close that loop so that you're actually enabling a sustainable economy by actually making sure that money circulates. Then when you do that too, a couple other benefits happen as well. So for one, when you've closed that loop, you can make more sustainable decisions. So you can say, all right, instead of let's say purchasing a like disposable pair of shoes that are going to dissolve after like a matter of months or like a year of use or something, that you're able to purchase a more expensive pair of shoes. It's more like an investment, and that lasts a lot longer. So that's tied into this lack of sufficient disposable income, because if you barely have any disposable income because all you can afford is what you need for food and housing and stuff, you have no discretionary income to actually spend on stuff, then you're saying, all right, I've only got a few bucks to spend. I have to buy the cheapest thing I can find. That is where a lot of this completely wasteful utilization of resources comes from, is that we're this disposable culture where it's really because all you can afford is this disposable culture. But then if you actually make sure everyone has the money that they can buy the things that last longer, then that's how where you not only create more lasting things and buy those lasting things, but then there's, I think, also more of a, let's fix what we have instead of just buying another thing. Because then there's also time involved. Like I think part of this too is, why aren't we fixing stuff? Fixing stuff takes time. It's so much easier just to toss something, buy something again cheap, and go from there. But again, if you're buying something more expensive and it's meant to last longer, then you're more likely to spend some time, if you have the basic income to allow that time, to actually make sure that this continues lasting longer. So there's like a couple psychological changes that I think are important to this. And, one of them has been observed too, as far as, let's say, an environmental outcome of basic income. And this was unconditional cash result. I can't remember which country it came from now. I have to look that up again. But the result of this unconditional grant was that people actually did less, cutting down of all the trees around them, that it reduced deforestation by 40%. And, so why was that? Well, the deforestation, a lot of that was coming from the need for money. And so when you made sure that people actually had money, that they didn't have to cut down trees, then they didn't. And instead they actually, created more jobs and, did more local things outside of that, which they obviously didn't want to do. And you see that elsewhere too, where you see increased self-employment through basic income, and you see less, like another one was a decrease in illegal hunting, aka poaching, by 95%, and that was in the Namibia UBI experiment. So I point to that and say, look, there are crimes, then there's stuff that people do for money that they would never do if they didn't feel that they had to do it. As soon as you actually make sure that they don't need to do it anymore, then they don't do it. And so I think that looking at that from an environmentalist perspective is important too, that there's a lot of things that we do, we know is bad for the environment, we know is unsustainable, but we feel that we have to do it as a result of not having.
So you would say essentially that the poverty drives the need for a cheap, disposable set of, I don't know, just anything, like cheap, disposable garbage that we buy, shoes, I don't know, plates, any like wardrobes, anything. So you say that is actually the poverty is preventing us from investing in something better and more permanent.
Yeah. In economic terms, it's called inferior goods, which is where when the demand increases, or when the money increases, the demand for that good decreases. Because usually you would expect that if with people more money, then demand would increase. But for inferior goods, they decrease. Another thing I want to mention too is the ability that basic income creates for a gift economy. And so, right now, let's say you need to engage in monetary transactions. But if you actually have enough money to pay for your basic needs, so that you've got your food, you've got your housing, you've got everything that are actually the actual basics, then you don't have to engage in transactions with other people. You can actually do it for free. Again, that's paid into the unpaid work element. So that you can say, all right, I'm going to make paintings. I'm going to be a painter, and I'm not going to charge anyone for it. Like I could do that, but actually I'm just going to make sure that people actually can have this, and say here, and then that's reciprocated. And other people can say, well, I'm feeling that I'm getting so much from others that I too am going to just do stuff and give. And so that's something that it's not really possible as long as you have to make enough money to survive. But as soon as you actually have those basics, then it really enables this more of a sharing economy, like a true sharing economy, to flourish. Imagine how many more people would be engaging as Wikipedia editors, or free software coders, or all these things that take up a lot of time and effort, but the only people doing them are those that actually are able to afford to do them, both money and time.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really interesting point. Actually, I hadn't ever quite considered it in those terms before. But I'm aware that we're sort of coming up to the hour. But so I want to ask my final question. So how would you like propose that I know we sort of touched on this briefly, but how would you propose that we fund it? Do you envision like a carbon tax, like a financial transaction tax, some form of just like I don't know, some sort of tax on fossil fuels, or there's so many ways you could do it. Like, what is your
Yeah.
do you have? Are you like maybe not married to one, but is there a way you prefer?
Yeah, I'm not married to one, but I certainly say have my preferences. First of all, like in a perfect world where people aren't concerned about taxes, then I would say just focus on getting the money out there. Because I think that right now, the fact that we enable, banks to create the money supplies, that money supply is made into existence via debt. I want to change that. I just think that, look, if we're going to create currency, then let's just create it and make sure that people have it as an individual, universal, right, that they are actually part of this seniorage process, instead of letting banks do it. So I would change the way that we make money, so that we can all benefit from it. That's say kind of a preference, and so that it's kind of like the MMT way of thinking.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that sort of, yeah.
But but when it comes into MMT, that's a whole other discussion too. But I do like that, this idea of governments aren't constrained by their ability to create currency. The constraints come through like, inflationary effects and, effects that arise from, say, creating too much currency so that negative things happen, so that you want to introduce taxes in order to reduce those things you don't want. It's a kind of a simplistic way of looking at MMT. But I think it's important that governments do look at this as not saying, how do we raise the money first and then calculate that all out and then do what they can with that money that they've raised, and just say, look, if this is important to us, then let's do it. And then we'll actually design taxes to make it so that it works the way we want it to. So looking at it that way, then I think it makes sense to use Pigovian taxes. So carbon taxes is a good example. I would love to see an annually rising carbon tax, as one thing. But I like the idea of Pigovian taxes. For those who aren't familiar with what that is, it's taxing those with stuff with externalized costs. So carbon taxes are the best example because we know that climate change is an externalized cost of the use of fossil fuels. That it is, it's not priced into the cost of, say, gasoline. When you spend money on gasoline, you're not spending for the costs of all the results of what happens when you burn it. And it's certainly the companies themselves, Exxon is not spending the money on the costs of climate change. It's all externalized to all of the earth. Everyone on earth is an externalized cost for us. So, the question is, what else can we tax in a way that we can reduce that behavior? And so that we all benefit from that. So, let's tax stuff that is let's say, it's like a tobacco tax that we could tax, you could utilize, say, marijuana revenue, for this stuff. And, also like, let's say like a soda tax, that was something where, people hated it in New York when it was proposed. Because if just a soda tax on its own it's almost like a tax on poverty, because it's something that more people who are in poverty are actually consuming because it's very cheap and it's something that they can afford. And if you make it more expensive, then you're hurting them. Yeah, it's healthier, but you're hurting them. So then when you actually introduced, like with the carbon dividend, that the way that works, so you raise revenue from taxes that you don't want. You make sure people get that revenue. So then there's that choice of saying, look, do I want to spend the higher cost on this, or do I want to change to something else? And so that's what kind of Bogovian taxes opens up, is this greater choice in choosing a better way instead of the way that we're going. And also, I think it's important when it comes to affording basic income, is looking at just what every country is already doing. And I don't just mean welfare programs, which is the way people usually look at it, but I'm also talking about like assistance to the tax code that people don't see as assistance. So, that means, your standard deduction that everyone receives, your, standard allowance, your tax subsidies, earned income tax credits, your housing subsidy, your tax credit. There's all kinds of things that we do and say, if you do that, then we'll reduce your taxes. And I say, no, stop doing that. Just, don't carve out all these ways for you to reduce your taxes. Just charge people the taxes and then make sure that the basic income is seen as like a universal tax rebate that you receive regardless of all that stuff. And so if you look at it that way, so many countries are, already doing this. They're already paying for a basic income. It's just what they're doing is saying you only get it if you do this, or you do this, or you do this, or you do this. And there's all different various ways of doing it. Just say, look, get rid of all that stuff, just flatten it out, make sure people have a floor, and you can utilize what you're already paying for. You're just saying no more conditions. Because there shouldn't be conditions on, people's basic survival.
I mean, along that line of thinking, it's really interesting. Today, I was wondering whether the level of fossil fuel subsidies that we give out are greater than the tax revenue that we get from those companies. And I was like, hang on, are we paying them to exist? I have to look up the figures, but like it's a similar line of thinking. Like, people don't often realize the sort of hidden costs of things. And you make a very, very good point about, there's a lot of countries who are already paying out the cost of a UBI without realizing.
Yeah. And when you talk about the hidden cost of things too, like the biggest hidden cost of all is poverty. All of us are paying for poverty in all kinds of ways. And not only is it about paying for actual poverty, like people living in poverty and those costs, but you're also paying for people being afraid of living in poverty. And so that actually results in a lot of stress, insecurity, and you can actually not live in poverty and you have all these negative consequences because of your fear of falling into poverty. So poverty itself is extremely expensive. It causes health outcomes that are negative, that then put strains on health systems, that it imposes costs on through the criminal justice system, through crime rates, through wouldn't exist otherwise. And there's also big productivity costs. So if if people are doing forms of work that they have no interest in, which is actually a global problem, only 15% of people worldwide are engaged by the work that they're being paid to do. So if you're engaged in work and you have no interest in it, you're just doing it for the paycheck, then that's bad for productivity. If you enable people through a basic income to actually find the work that they want to do, that they're really engaged in, then you actually enable more productivity. And so I see this as a lost productivity cost through this maintenance of poverty too. So again, every country is already paying a lot of money to not have a basic income, and they're already paying for basic income in all these varying ways. And we should just change all of that so that we just make sure people start with the UBI.
Okay, that's a pretty nice place to leave things. Is there anything you wanna plug before we wrap up here?
I guess internationally even too, just recommend that people contact their representatives and just get them to support basic income. That's the only way it's going to happen, is if people are actually being active and reaching out to politicians and getting them as politicians to understand that, hey, this is actually a big issue, and if I'm against it, then I may not win. And if I'm for it, it increases my chances of winning. And when politicians all over the world start to realize that there's that equation going on, then there's going to be a lot more people pushing for basic income, and there's going to be a lot more countries that adopt basic income. And for every country that adopts basic income, I think is going to encourage others, because there's going to be positive consequences that happen out of that. And I think you're going to see a positive feedback loop build. And that's how we actually get this going on like a worldwide level, where we're actually making a big progress in eliminating poverty worldwide.
Well, I hope we move in that direction. Maybe I'm quite optimistic that the pandemic and the sort of subsequent lockdowns and whatnot will actually change a lot. And perhaps, our attitudes to UBI will be one of them. I mean, it's a little too early to tell on a lot of fronts, but fingers crossed.
Yeah, well, not just fingers crossed. We got to make it happen.
Well, there you go. We got to make it happen. That is the message. But yeah, man, that was an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available to pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks for listening.